Chapter 13, Capital Expenditures. Long-term assets. Capital expenditures, in essence, are assets that has a lifespan of longer than a year. But typically, it's a lot longer than just a year. You're talking about assets that are expected to bring residual income over the course of several years. Depending on the particular asset, assets can be useful for 20, 30, 40 years. And so it typically requires a significant investment of financial capital over a long period of time. Sometimes it requires fundraising. There are times where different reserves are used to fund this particular expenditure, but this is expected to bring in a significant return. And anything that brings in a significant return typically comes with a significant amount of risk as well. So capital expenditures are assets to the companies that will be used over a long period of time to bring in a significant amount of revenue over that period of time. Now here's some examples of capital assets. For those that are keeping up with what's happening with your university, Mercer is starting a football team in the fall of 2013. And we'll begin our football season. And in order to have a football team and to have home games, Mercer had to build a stadium. And that stadium would be considered a capital asset. It was a multi-million-dollar project that is expected to bring in significant amount of revenue over a long period of time. Now, if the football team is not as successful as expected, and that the revenue generated from the sport does not meet expectations, then this building of this type of asset could be a huge loss to the university. And that is the risk involved in that type of capital asset and these types as examples that I'm sharing with you here. When analyzing the need for a capital project, there is typically a lot of collaboration. You want to be able to justify the need for the project. You want to make sure that your valuation of expected income is accurate. And you want to be able to make sure that it adds significant value long term to the company. And of course, it must be consistent with the company's overall corporate strategy. But once the project is approved, it must be tracked regularly. You must determine if everything is going to plan, and you must monitor the progress over the entire time frame of this particular purchase of the investment. And then once the investment has securely been implemented, you want to make sure that it is meeting the expectations from the initial purchase or development decision. Now, as a wrap up, capital expenditures are assets that can be purchased, sold, or discarded. In the example that I mentioned earlier of the stadium that Mercer's building, it's very difficult to sell or discard something that you're building on your campus. However, that also can be reallocated for different use if it didn't add the value as expected. So those are some of the things that you can do with a capital expenditure. Capital expenditures usually used to replace things that are obsolete or to expand or improve. Using the same example of Mercer, you guys benefit from the system that you now know as My Mercer, that was formerly an old, antiquated system that had to be updated and was becoming obsolete. So Mercer took a massive investment in a student information system in order to make sure that you had a tool that was user-friendly, up-to-date, and effective for modern purposes. Now, capital expenditure is typically put in as a budget item to be allocated over time, and a lot of times over departments or divisions, so that you can spread costs out evenly, or as evenly as possible, and you can still function daily and achieve the company's overall objectives. So that's chapter 13 in a summary. As you see, we're going from chapter 13 to chapter 20. Now we're looking at capital budgeting, and we're optimizing now long-term investments and ultimately making investment decisions. In chapter 13, we discussed the acquisition of capital assets and what capital expenditures consist of. In this chapter, we're going to look at how do we make the decisions on which capital asset to acquire. Making capital assets decisions or making capital budget decisions has to have a strategic process built into it. We have to find out what are the risk return trade-offs, what's the benefit ultimately to the company, what type of effect would this decision have on cash flow, ongoing operational activities, etc. And there are two categories that a capital budget decision goes into. And those two categories are, one, a screening decision, and two, a preference decision. The screening decision says, I'm going to look at a few alternatives, and I'm going to choose the best, most financial feasible alternative amongst those alternatives. And the preference decision says, we're going to choose one decision over another for reasons that may or may not be the most sound financial decision. It may be a political decision. It may be a decision that will benefit constituencies or the community at large, but absolutely may not be the most sound financial move. As long as the decision made does not put the company in jeopardy or in danger, then either one of these decision methods can be used. There are several types of capital budget decisions that will be made, and this is just a very minimal view of some alternatives. Cost reduction programs, as you see, asset replacements, mergers or acquisitions, and there are some no profit investments. And once again, those kind of no profit investments are sometimes done to either stay competitive, to become competitive, to help and assist with branding, or to be a move that assists the community and has some other intangible benefit. Here are the factors that must be considered when making a capital expenditure decision. And as you will see later on in this chapter through your readings and somewhat in the rest of this slide, how the need for considering these factors are vital to making the right decision. Now let's look at this term, cost of capital. We're going to go into a part of the slide that some financial calculations must be done in order to make sound decisions. But let's look at the term cost of capital. Cost of capital, in essence, is an opportunity cost of an investment. It is what that investment dollar that you're using toward a particular project costs you among alternatives. And I just kind of put a a simple diagram on this slide so that you can get an idea of the impact of cost of capital. Questions that you need to consider are: what's the riskiness of the earnings? How risky is this investment? Likely is it to succeed and or fail? The debt to equity mix of your particular company. Can you afford more debt to put? Do you have enough equity in order to offset some of the debt that you already have and that would be added in addition to your firm with the acquisition of this particular capital asset? How financially sound is the firm, and the interest rate that you would be charged for this particular amount of money. So all of these are considered what we talk about as costs of capital, and they are vital when you're making investment decisions. So here you'll see some other very significant facts about the cost of capital. One is the overall percentage cost of funds used to finance an investment. It's the composite or the total cost of all the individual sources of those particular funds for that investment. And the cost of capital will depend largely on the cost of that capital from each source on which the capital was used. And always remember that the goal of an individual or business is to limit the investment to assets that provide a return that's higher than the cost of capital. So meaning that you never want to make an investment that is going to yield a return that's lower than what it costs you to acquire those funds. So as we go forward into these slides and go forward into valuation methods, you want to understand the importance of cost of capital when making decisions. Now, probably the most significant and the most valuable valuation method for determining the viability of a particular project is the net present value method. It compares your present value of future cash from an investment with the initial outlay of cash. And we'll see a formula in just a second. We'll talk about the payback period in a little while, but it's more powerful than a payback method because it considers the time value of money and it considers what we just talked about, the cost of capital. And as I said, it's usually the first choice for analyzing a capital expenditure. So, okay, here's what you need to know about net present value. Net present value is equal to the present value, the total present value, minus the initial cash outlay. What did it cost you? When calculating net present value, if a project's value is greater than 0, then it should always be accepted. If it's less than 0, then you should reject it and not do the project. The present value ratio, or probability index, allows for ranking of alternative projects, which means that if you're looking at a few different projects, then of course the ones with the highest present value ratio is the one that we would choose, and you would rank the others accordingly. And a net present value is expressed in terms of dollars, not percentage. So the formula for net present value is your net present value is equal to your present value minus your initial investment. So now we're going to look at pages 361 to 366, and I want you to look at Appendix 1 so we can talk about how do you calculate present value. Now before I dive into this slide, I want you to take your eyes to page 508 in your text. On page 508, that's your present value table. And your present value table tells you a few things. One, it tells you how much a dollar will be worth $1 at what cost of capital over what time period. So how does it do that? So if I were to ask you, tell me what the present value of $1 would be today, 5 years from today, at a 5% cost of capital. What you should tell me is $1 would be worth approximately 78 cents. Because you would take your eye across horizontally to where it says 5%, which is your cost of capital. Put your finger on that number and drag it down to year 5, where you see a decimal point which says 0.7835. That represents the value of $1 today, 5 years from now, at a 5% cost of capital. If I would ask you the same question on $10 over the same time frame, then you would multiply 10 times the 78 cents, and that would give you the value of $10 at that time frame and at that cost of capital. Now, I know for some of you guys that's going to take a little while to marinate, so you have to really look at some of these examples in depth. So let's look at this example on this slide now. So an investment that costs $10,000, that is going to be your initial investment. You have a cost of capital of 7%. Now, over the next 4 years, you are expected to have the following cash inflows. Year 1, $3,000. Year 2, $8,500. Year 3, $10,000. Year 4, $16,000. So you would use your present value multiplier, which is what we just looked at in the text. So you would take your eye for year 1, your finger for year 1, and go over year 1 at 7%. 7% year 1, you see your multiplier is 0.9346. You would take that multiplier, multiply that times your cash flow, which is $3,000, and that would give you your present value. You would do the exact same thing for year 2, year 3, and year 4. You would add up each value from each year to get a total present value. So the total present value for this particular investment over this particular time frame at this cost of capital will be $29,574.50. So you subtract that amount from your initial investment of $10,000, and you have a net present value of $19,574.50, which means that you should accept this particular project. Now, your accounting simple rate of return, it's a lot different than your cost of capital, whereas it's easier to calculate. Now, your accounting simple rate of return says this: it measures your profitability by comparing your investment to your future earnings. And here are the following steps. 1, you have to identify how much the initial investment is. 2, you have to find or estimate the useful life of the capital asset. So what is the life of your asset? How long is it going to be used? Step 3, you have to determine your cash inflows per year that are attributable to that particular investment. Step 4, you want to calculate depreciation. Now, depreciation is calculated by taking your investment, subtracting it from the salvage value. Salvage value is the amount that it's worth after its useful life has expired. And then you want to divide that over the life of the asset. So in order to calculate the accounting rate of return, or the ARR, you take your average annual cash inflow. So what's the average amount of funds received from a particular investment over time, subtract it from your depreciation, which is what you've calculated in step 4, and divide it over your entire investment. And that will give you a percentage, and that percentage would be your accounting or your simple rate of return on this particular project. Now, here are the advantages. It's easy to calculate. It does consider profitability. It has numbers connected to the financial plans, and it considers the full useful life of the asset, which is important. Here are the disadvantages. It ignores time value of money, which is what we saw when we calculated net present value. The net present value captured time value of money. This ignores it, and you don't see any aspect of it. So there's no depreciation in the dollar over that particular course of or that time period, which we know that there is. And it only uses income data. See, that's why I use the word cash inflows and not cash flows. Cash inflows is the amount of total revenue received over a course of time for a particular project. Cash flow is the liquidity that is received over a period of time. So let's see how to calculate it next. So let's look at this example. So assume that you have an investment, a $10,000 investment. Now the salvage value, meaning the value remaining at the end of its useful life, is $1,000. The life of the asset is 5 years. And you have cash flows over that 5-year time frame of $2,000, $2,500, $4,000, $6,000, and $7,000. And now I want you to tell me, what is the accounting rate of return? So the first thing you need to do is you have to calculate the depreciation. Depreciation, you find the investment, $10,000. You subtract that $10,000 from that $10,000. You want to take your salvage value, which I've calculated. I told you that it's $1,000, divided by the life of the asset, 5 years, and you would get $1,800 is your depreciation. That's your depreciable amount over the course of its life. So now you can plug that number in to the next portion of the formula. So as you see, the average cash flows over that time period, the 5-year time period, is $4,300. So you have your average cash flows minus your depreciation divided by your investment. That would give you an accounting rate of return of 0.25 or 25%. The accounting rate of return is always expressed as percentage and never as dollars. So you can use that percentage, of course, to calculate dollars, but it's always expressed as a percentage. Now I want you to see page 357 and 358 for some examples and so you to practice. And you can also look at Appendix 1 as well. Now your payback period is exactly the way it sounds. It's the number of years or the amount of time that it takes to recoup an initial investment. So it's very similar to that of a break-even point. But unlike the break-even point, where break-even point measures the amount of money needed, this measures the amount of time that it will take. So when you're looking at payback period, you're taking your initial investment minus your annual cash flows until that particular time is reached. And we'll look at the next slide for details. And if you're looking at the payback period of an annuity, then it's just your initial investment divided by your annual cash inflows. Now, what is an annuity? An annuity is having the exact same amount of money over a certain amount of time. So, for example, if you were expecting an investment to generate $1,000 per year for the next 10 years, and that number will not change, then that would be considered an annuity. But if you're expecting $1,000 one year and $500 another year and $2,000 the next year, then that would not be considered an annuity because that amount will change. Now, advantage of it is that it's very easy to use and understand. Handles risk very effectively. It's very good when calculating how long you can have funds floating or outstanding. And you can use the payback period with other techniques. So the payback period is typically not a evaluation method in and of itself. It gives you some perspective. Now, disadvantages: it ignores time value of money. There's no consideration of cash flows after your money's paid back. There's no measure of profitability. There's no maximum payback period that's allowed unless it's set by the company. And it typically penalizes projects with small initial cash flows. So if we're saying that a project will only bring meager returns over the first couple of years, but large returns over the next few years, we may pass on a project if we say that it takes too long. So just some of the advantages and disadvantages. Now here are some of the steps that you use to calculate payback period. 1, you identify an investment. You deduct the annual cash flow from the investment. You would stop calculation just before the year when the payback will be achieved, because this will give you the payback year. Then you would divide the cash flow of the preceding payback year by the ensuing year. Don't worry about the language. I'll show you an example in just a second. This would give you the month of the payback, and it would be in decimal form. You would then multiply the month that you had in decimal form by 12, which is the number of months in a year, and that would give you the actual payback month, and potentially will give you a payback day. And then you take that multiplier and multiply that by the number of days in a particular month, and that would give you the actual payback date. Don't worry about that. If I just confuse you a little bit, I'll try to clear it up on the next slide. So here's an example. $10,000 investment. You're expecting the life of this asset, let's say, to be 7 years. And here are your current cash inflows. So because the cash inflows vary, then you would not be able to use the annuity method in calculating your payback. So you would have to take your initial investment and subtract it from each year's cash inflow. So $10,000 minus $2,550 minus $1,650 minus $1,270 minus $2,910 would give you a particular number, 1,620. Now we see that we achieved that after year 4. So it's at the end of year 4 where we still are $1,620 away from the payback period. So that we know that the payback happens in year 5. Now, because we know that the payback happens in year 5, so we say that we're going to take that amount, 1620, and we divide it by the next year's expected cash inflows. So the next year's expected cash inflows is $2,015. So 1620 divided by 2015 gives you 0.8. So that's the month in decimal form. So 5.8 months is the payback period. Your text stops there. And I'm going to push you a little further, because I want you to tell me exactly when the payback period is. So in order to get that, I would have to multiply that decimal point of 0.8, because I have no idea what that 0.8 represents, time the number of months in a year. And so 0.8 times 12 gives me 9.6. And that whole number of 9 represents the month that the payback will be paid. So I know that 5 years and 9 months I will be recouping all of my initial investment. Now the 0.6 tells me that's the day that I should expect my initial investment, assuming my cash flow inflow numbers are correct. So then I would multiply 0.6 times the number of days in that month. September has 30 days, and that would give me 18. So my payback for that investment would be exactly 5 years, 9 months, and 18 days. Now, I may not ask for that level of specificity, but I can. So I want you to know how to do it. Your internal rate of return. Your internal rate of return has several advantages and disadvantages like any other valuation method. It considers time value of money, and it's more realistic and accurate than the ARR, or the accounting rate of return, because it does consider that. However, the disadvantage is that it is very difficult and time consuming to calculate. There is no consideration of varying investment sizes, and because there's so many fluid natures of projects, they could all yield different IRRs, or internal rate of returns. The internal rate of return is also known as the discount rate, and it is at the point where your net present value equals 0 or is very close to 0. The higher the discount rate, the better the return on the project. Another kind of concern is that the calculation of this particular valuation method is done by trial and error. So you have to plug in numbers until you have all your numbers plugged in and you understand which of your alternatives is closest to 0. You'll see that on page 373 and 377. So look for those examples and try to work through that as we go a little further in this slide. So here's your example. So let's assume that a project is going to cost $500,000, but it's expected to produce the following cash inflows. Year 1, $110,000. Year 2, $130,000. Year 3, $155,000. Year 4, $175,000. So using trial and error, you have to calculate the internal rate of return. So I want you to look at example 14 in your text on page 374. That will be a excellent tool for you to use when trying to figure out where do you go next with this calculation. So I would give you on a particular exam a chart, and you would have to figure out the internal rate of return. In this particular example, as you see in year 1, at a 5% cost of capital and using a present value factor of 0.952, the present value of that $110,000 in year 1 would be $104,720. You would have to do the exact same thing for at a 7% cost of capital and at a 3% cost of capital. So you would do those cash inflows at that cost of capital over the course of that time frame, the 4 years. You subtract your present value from your initial investment, and whichever net present value is closest to 0, that would tell you what your internal rate of return would be. So for this particular project, your internal rate of return will be a little bit greater than 5%. please spend some time looking at examples in the text, and I will also post some additional practice problems as well. So to wrap up chapter 20, capital budgeting is a vital part of the budgeting process. Capital budgeting and project selection allows a corporation to choose projects that are beneficial to the company's long-term, short-term, and intermediate strategic plans and strategies. The capital budgeting process allows for leaders in the organizations to make sound decisions about which investment alternative to choose. And the utilization of all of the valuation methods that we used are critical when making decisions and with explaining how a decision was determined.